Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back Steve Sullivan.
Hello everyone, welcome back, and thank you again to Quantcast for the refreshments. I'm really excited about this next session. I like to think of it as two full standard deviations from the norm of what you would expect to see at an ad technology conference like this, which is a shame because the subject matter is so very important. Michael Tiffany, CEO and co-founder of White Ops, is here to draw on his background as an internet security specialist to help us understand how to protect our consumers and brands. Please help me welcome Michael Tiffany.
Hello, advertising world.
Hello.
I'm Michael Tiffany. I'm the CEO of White Ops, and I'm here to brief you about an operation which we've been running since last year called Bot or Not in online security, and specifically botnets. White Ops is founded by security and defense experts. We have no particular advertising expertise, and we didn't even start out pursuing botnets in advertising. Our focus was on bank fraud. The absolutely most cutting edge malware development, the crimeware that perpetrates crimes on the internet, is focused on stealing state secrets and disrupting nuclear proliferation, things like that. But I'm not going to talk about that today. The most sophisticated crimeware, the stuff that the criminal underground is using on the internet, is built to steal primarily credit cards, personal information, and also bank balances. But that market hasn't been good over the past couple of years. I won't bore you with statistics. I can illustrate this with just one fact. The average price of a newly stolen credit card on the black market is just 25 cents. It used to be hard to steal credit cards, and you used to be able to get away with a lot of credit card fraud, but no longer. It's substantially easier to steal the numbers, but you can do less with them. So steal 10,000 credit card numbers sounds like a good haul. This will net you just 2,500 bucks. Now, bank robbery continues to be a good business. It's where the money is. However, no matter how sophisticated your technology, there are signs that someone will notice eventually when you rob a bank account. No matter how good your tech stack, someone will notice that the money is missing. So we tracked the bad guys here in advertising, which is how I ended up on this stage, because we found that this incredibly sophisticated technology, what we call rootkits and exploits and the payloads that run on those things, originally developed to perpetrate bank fraud, has been reapplied to pursue the $36 billion in online advertising spending each year. Because while this is a sophisticated market, it's well structured, and it's been growing more sophisticated, there's a lot of room for fraud. How much room? Well, the estimates are all over the map. It's widely understood that there's fraud in the advertising market, but the extent has been hard to pin down. And that's because it's very difficult to directly detect the fraud in this scene. So instead, what various people who've tried to get their arms around the problem have done is looked at the signs of fraud. So you'll notice whenever you look at these estimates of fraud that they're always couched in certain kind of wiggle terms. So we talk about very low quality traffic or suspicious traffic. And this is because no one wants to pin down the actual hard figures associated with, say, actual botnet traffic, because that's hard to detect. Instead, you look for statistical anomalies, things that don't really make sense. And in the aggregate, you can kind of back into a number. It's still all over the map. Before I go on, I want to give you a brief overview of how the bad guys actually get paid. Fundamentally, the mechanic is always the same, which is that a website somewhere receives money. They're receiving that money from an ad network or one of the other players in the ecosystem that actually pays out affiliate fees for views. And the basic fraud is this. You inflate your numbers by sending fraudulent traffic to the sites that are under your control. Sometimes those sites are actually operated by the botnet operators, the guys who have control millions of machines, or sometimes they're paid off downstream from the publishers who collect these fraudulently inflated revenues. So the name of the game from the botnet operator's perspective is hiding their fake traffic in among the human traffic. And it's not a monolithic enemy. We're not talking about a group of bad guys who get together at some bad guy convention and compare notes and decide on how to defraud the advertising industry. Instead, the entire scene is actually composed, it's a fascinating evolutionary landscape, of many, many fraud groups pursuing different strategies at differing levels of sophistication. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Let's dive into some of the models for fraud. The first is the easiest to understand, but in many ways also the most sophisticated. Really, really good operations, the kinds that are extraordinarily good at hiding in the noise, simply directly target ad networks. So you'll have botnet operators who are operating their own cash out points. Those are the fake publishers that look like legit websites. And they send fraudulent traffic typically to a very, very large number of these sites that all look independent, but aren't. The first order fraudsters have to be able to defeat the big data techniques of the most sophisticated ad networks, so they tend to be really good. And they're good not necessarily just because they've done some good reverse engineering against the defensive measures that they're up against, but simply because they've survived. Ad fraud detection has been going on for quite some time, and broadly speaking, the state of the art in detection is applying what we'd now term big data to the problem. You're looking at statistical anomalies and you're applying big data heuristics to find the sites that just don't seem to make any sense. Well, over time, that has formed a kind of selection pressure against which the bad guys have evolved. So if you're not good at hiding in the noise, you stopped your fraud game several years ago. The guys who have remained are the ones that have survived against that selection pressure. Moving into a higher level of sophistication, we have what we call the traffic washers. And this is really fascinating. It took us quite some time to really crack the code on. What we started seeing was a great deal of automated traffic coming from sites that clearly weren't operating bots themselves. And at first this didn't make any sense, because why would these bots be viewing websites and clicking on ads that they weren't getting paid for? Digging deeper, we found that the way it works is this. You have a very large number of sites, sometimes operating perfectly independently of each other, and in many cases not really understanding the fraud mechanics, who are simply playing traffic arbitrage. So they have found that they can buy cheap traffic on low-end traffic sources. This could be PPC ad networks, various companies that specialize in traffic sourcing for very low amounts of money. This traffic typically is highly bot-ridden, and they host on their websites higher, more premium ads that might be exchange traded or otherwise. And they find that some amount of the traffic that they buy goes and clicks on. So they're simply looking at the amount of money that they spend on buying that traffic and the amount of money that they make through the click-through rates. And if it's positive, they're not asking terribly difficult questions. They're just collecting checks. The effect is that these middlemen sites effectively wash the traffic. And sometimes they can look really legitimate. We see a lot of domain holding pages that actually operate this way, which kind of solves an open mystery that maybe many of us here have had, which is, when you typo a domain, you end up at some page that's hosting ads. It sounds remarkable, like, really? Are there that many people who click on an ad after doing a domain typo? Well, in many cases, incredibly, these domain holding pages are themselves buyers of advertising on the PPC networks or otherwise, and they're actually traffic arbitrageurs participating in the overall fraud scene. Now, incredibly, a similar dynamic can be seen in premium publishers, and this really just blew our mind. We've been running across core network traffic for some time now, and we've been seeing bot traffic landing on premium publisher pages operated by people who clearly have absolutely no interest in perpetuating a fraud problem. But digging deeper, what we found is that many premium publishers themselves buy advertising their sites as destinations, and if they cast a wide net, some of the traffic that they ultimately source comes from these lower grade systems and ends up on really premium inventory. Now, the reason why this took such a long time to crack is that it seems counterintuitive. Why are the bots clicking on and on and on when they're only getting paid on their first click? Well, once you own a botnet, making them click on stuff is relatively cheap. So the overall fraud landscape has adapted to this reality. And we see what we call just keep clicking bots. They visit the cash out point. That's the site that's actually operated by the fraud operator and collects a check, and they click on an ad. If the page that they land on also has ads, they'll click on that at an ever decreasing CTR, because the further you get away from the cash out point of the bad guys, the more likely that you're getting towards premium content where someone actually cares about rational CTRs. Those clicks don't directly pay off the fraudsters, but they ensure that there's always a market for that kind of traffic, because the middlemen are just looking at the cost of acquiring traffic and the money that they make from the traffic that moves on, and as long as that's positive, there will be an ever-present desire for the really low-end network traffic. There are more premium problems. For example, third-party SEO, web optimization firms, and increasingly we're seeing social media strategy firms often goose their own numbers. What happens is a publisher will hire one of these third-party consultants to optimize their website in some way, and to ensure that the contract gets renewed, that third party sends a little bot traffic, creating a big boost before and after. And those people can also be essentially arbitrageurs. Their SEO strategies and their social media boosting strategies often involve this really wide net casting that ends up working because it attracts bot traffic. So you see top line increases and you'll see increases on any of the performance metrics that bots are good at faking, like staying on the site, wiggling the mouse around and appearing to engage with content, but never increases in things that bots aren't very good at doing, like buying things. Then we get into really sophisticated stuff. Bots visiting premium inventory specifically to game third-party audience trackers, and sometimes they will emulate conversion activities just to mess with parts of this ecosystem that are built around targeting audiences and that have nothing to do with the premium sites that they're visiting at first. Remember that the bot traffic is cheap to the criminal operators. So it doesn't cost any more to have your bot first browse around some automotive sites, maybe another e-commerce site, and maybe even place an object in a cart. This is a great scam because it ensures that the bot later is going to be retargeted for that thing that it hasn't bought yet but is in a cart. And some relatively minor actions on the part of bots in the pre-payout phase can result in higher CPMs when they finally do visit the cash out point, and the potential for whitelisting, which is just hilarious. If you think about the signaling value of certain kinds of economic activities on the web, it actually makes sense for a bot operator to make its bots go through some conversion activities, even ones that cost money, if it means that part of its botnet gets whitelisted as a known good consumer that'll get targeted for further ads for like the rest of the month. Now, this is perhaps the most counterintuitive lesson learned from our entire operation since last year. Because I'm sure that there are many people in this room who either are or know about some of the amazing big data geniuses that have moved in to the advertising field. These are people who are no longer marketing to undifferentiated blocks of consumers like this graph. It's so 1999. Instead, when you're targeting someone with an ad, you're not targeting this demographic block necessarily. You know that that is Bob Smith. You know what Bob Smith bought last week. You know that this session is with Bob Smith, and you can match some other third-party data that you have and have analyzed in real time to give Bob Smith an ad that he's interested in. So how does the fraud enter into this picture? We're not marketing to the little critters there. We've broken down this audience into its actual bare essential parts. Well, the problem is that you have managed to target Bob Smith's computer, but I'm afraid that's not Bob Smith. Botnets are composed of real machines, and they're extraordinarily pervasive in North American broadband households right now. At least 15% of American broadband households are owned. They're running malware and participating in a botnet right now. And I'm afraid that number is growing, not shrinking. And the way that these rootkits are built and the way that the best ad fraudsters perpetuate their schemes is by using the fact that their software, which is running in the background on regular persons' machines, has access to all the cookies, all the metadata from the legitimate web sessions that are happening on that machine. So when they're perpetrating their fraud, they can reuse that metadata. And they found that if they actively game the third-party targeting mechanisms that are brilliant and have been built and deployed pervasively throughout this stack, then they win. And they win in a way that makes bank robbery look like such a hassle, because you don't need money mules, you don't need to exfiltrate cash from outside the country, none of that. This is a crime that flies under the radar, and at the end of the day, you get a check and you just cash it. So there are fewer moving parts. You're using the same tech stack, and granted that's an expensive thing to buy, but you need fewer employees. No one needs to actually physically visit anywhere, and you just need bank accounts that can collect money. Now, of course, we haven't invented detection techniques. This has been going on for some time. The trouble with current detection techniques is that they provide false signals of success, because there are continuously new entrants into the fraud scene who are trying, let's call it the obvious stuff. So if you know how to detect some fraud, you're going to detect that fraud. So it feels like you're winning, but you're missing the adapters, the much more sophisticated guys who have figured out the ways to fly under the radar, especially by actively exploiting the system. We're not dealing with casual criminals anymore. If you are good enough at fraud right now to get any sort of check at all, that check is $1 million worth. That kind of money can be applied to extremely good reverse engineers, guys who can put a lot of resources to bear in figuring out exactly what the thresholds are for staying under the radar in terms of big data detection, can figure out exactly what the mechanisms are for getting targeted, and can optimize their strategies using the same kinds of techniques that we're all using to make our websites better. A/B testing and continuous integration. That's the reality of what we're seeing right now. Now, I think that this is becoming more broadly recognized, and we're starting to move towards better metrics for success. For example, we're seeing some markets move towards measuring viewability, which will weed out some of the simpler bots that don't know how to fake viewability. And already people who are adopting viewability measures and deploying them are seeing improvements, but unfortunately, a very large percentage of the bot population that we've caught already knows how to fake viewability. In fact, that really surprised me, because typically the bad guys lag. They only respond to changing market dynamics. You don't see a lot of foresight, but techniques developed in order to defeat other tests for humanness, for example, virtualizing your bot so it runs in a VM on regular people's machines, also works extraordinarily well for faking viewability. So in this case, people are ahead of the game. Our own shift in metrics, the one that we're using as we track our success here, is cost per human. Because the fundamental resource that advertising is aiming at isn't about publishers, really. It's not about impressions. It's about human attention. And that has a fixed amount of bandwidth. That has a fixed supply. It's the bot traffic that makes online advertising inventory appear infinite, even though it's not. So when you manage towards cost per human, instead of CPM, you have a manageable metric that accounts for the differences between your top-line buying and the actual number of humans that you reach. We're starting to move towards solving the problem in a particular way that does not involve screaming about the problem. Right? We started last year. This is my first public appearance. We've really been flying under the radar, and that's because we think that the only way to defeat the bad guys is by actually disrupting the way that they get paid. And doing that does not require the, I don't know, let's call it the usual way that security companies go about doing business, which is finding a problem and then screaming about it and hoping that they scare enough people into buying a product from them. Here, what we have to do is first acknowledge how the bad guys are gaming the system, therefore acknowledging how current detection methods aren't working, and really get under the problem. And that's what we've done by developing a way to fingerprint bots directly. Now, I'm not used to talking about sources and methods, but I thought I would add one slide just briefly touching on how it is that we have this intel. We've developed a technology that directly detects bot traffic. So when you run it through the core of advertising flows, we can identify bot sessions and distinguish them from human sessions even when they're coming from the same computer, which is really remarkable. We're using that to determine which computers are owned, but also, and vastly more importantly, which sites are used as cash out points for the bad guys. Because ultimately what we're talking about is a kind of ongoing economic warfare. Our goal, and I think the goal of everyone in this room, is 100% human impressions. We'd like to match cost per human back up with cost per thousand. Now, it's not just advertisers who are losing because of the fraud scene. It's also publishers. Premium publishers who aren't inflating their numbers with bots see their prices down because they're effectively competing with fakers. The fact is that bots can't distinguish between adorable cat videos and boring cat videos. They'll go anywhere that their bot masters send them. So the wrong content is getting monetized. The wrong people are getting paid. Eliminating bot traffic means not lowering ad spends, but simply redirecting them away from the sites they shouldn't be going to the ones that deserve them. So we're talking about probably increased prices for really premium content if it can be effectively distinguished from the stuff that's being gamed. It's a difficult prospect because, as I showed you, the fraud mechanisms are so pervasive that they can end up sometimes on premium sites. And also, of course, we're talking about cutting off money supplies to the bad guys, which really means stopping a flow of money from advertisers to literally organized crime. And that's what brings me here today. I'm hoping that we can align interests about eliminating fraud from this ecosystem because it's not just about efficiency. We can improve the operations of this industry. We can improve the performance of advertising because the bot traffic is overwhelmingly large and is messing with not just return on investment, but lots of decision models and other meta-analysis that's going into advertising. We can make the system better, but what I want to see is this money getting cut off from organized crime. I've told you that if you're doing this job at all well, the fraud job, you're making millions of dollars. And there are many of these groups. They're literally extracting billions of dollars from this ecosystem, and they're not doing nice things with that money. This is the money that forms the buy side for new exploit development, new ways of breaking into people's computers. It's preposterous that 1/6 of US consumers have a compromised computer. It's ridiculous. They're building new rootkits, new payloads. This is the money that is employing those reverse engineers, those coders who could have had a day job doing something more productive and instead are building crimeware. If we cut off this money, it'll have a dramatic effect on the entire criminal ecosystem, really punching above its weight. It's going to improve the advertising world, but I think it'll also have a real world effect that trickles down and operates globally. Because this is the money that in many ways is directly making the world worse. It is funding compromise. So that's the end of my presentation. I have about 5 minutes for fielding a few questions if there are follow-ups.
I actually do have a question for you, Michael.
Yes.
This is incredibly interesting. I used to think I knew a lot about this stuff, but maybe not as much as I hoped I had. I have a question about some of the articles that Mike Shields has written recently.
Yes.
Adweek talked a bit about. He named names that you guys can all read the articles, but there were companies in there and there were examples in his articles.
Right.
What has that done? Has that resulted in anything good or beneficial?
It's a very good question. So we started operation last year, so we've been able to see how the overall fraud scene has changed in let's call it the pre-expose days and the post-expose days. There were several companies actually named in those Adweek articles as sources of fraudulent traffic, and according to our data, none of them were bot operators. They were all traffic arbitrageurs. So they were guilty not necessarily of running bots, but by actually concentrating so much bad traffic across their networks of sites that you could hardly miss them. So several of those guys went out of business, and this is the remarkable thing. Aggregate levels of fraud didn't move. We cut off some major Hydra heads, and what happened? A whole bunch of smaller heads sprouted up, and because of the traffic washing effect, this happened automatically and naturally. So measures like this that seem like they're going to have such a big effect, right? Let's bring some accountability to the market, let's name and shame. It doesn't have an actual effect on the profitability to the bad guys. It's really just picking the winners. So it's just shifting the money around, and we've seen a shift already also in bot operating strategies, where in one of the articles that I read, we saw how some really beautiful graph theory was brought to bear on identifying fraudulent traffic, and it had to do with building out networks that evaluated the relationships between the same cookie across multiple sites and wildly different demographics. Awesome work. It was really, really good. Subsequent to that, and very soon thereafter, only about 30 days after, we started to see a new kind of traffic arbitrageur that was operating networks of sites that were all demographically linked. So when they had a high level of cookie crossover, it simply wouldn't be that suspicious. And the bot traffic sources were essentially resetting the bots on a more frequent basis and operating them in segments so that you couldn't do this cookie comparison anymore because the bots kind of traveled in packs that were demographically linked. It was really remarkable.
Thank you.
Yes?
Yeah, I'm interested in botnets as a career move. I'm over here. I mean, who are these people? How do they recruit? Where are their offices? I mean, I was always impressed with the James Bond novels, because who would want to go to work for Dr. No? Or who would want to go to work for Blofeld? And yet, obviously, there's a business in this.
Yes.
I grew up in New Jersey, so we knew who the mafia guys were, right? You know, and we knew how they operated. Where are these guys? How do they recruit? How does that work?
Great question. So it's much worse out there now. Cybercrime is vastly more sophisticated right now than it was 10 years ago. And it's because of a social shift that's really remarkable. It used to be the case that if you wanted to be a cyber criminal, you needed to be a badass programmer. You needed to be really, really good. You needed to have reverse engineering caliber talent. And you needed criminal skills. Because moving money around untraceably, these are things that organized crime is really good at, and all of the programmers that you know are probably not good at. So the crossover population of people who could write the code and then also get away with the crime was relatively low. What's happened over the past decade is we've seen a separation of skills because the black market has grown significantly more sophisticated. Why? Really because of social networking. The rise of social networking across the internet has created good tools for establishing a reputation online that's connected to a pseudonym and not necessarily connected to instructions that the police could use to bang down your door. So the black market has evolved in a way that it hasn't been able to for the first 10,000 years of the black market. Prices are usually low on the black market because you can't trust criminals. Now, on the internet, you can establish yourself as a damn fine vendor of quality crimeware. You can have positive 5-star reviews, and that can help your customers make a decision to buy your product without providing the police with the information they need to come catch you. So now what you have is specialization. There are guys who just build new ways to break into machines, guys who just build new rootkits, and the botnet operators simply buy this tech stack on the open market. That's what's made the software so sophisticated. So to get into this, well, you're going to need to learn to speak Russian, because most of the online forums are in Russian, even if you're not a native speaker, and you're definitely going to need to change your locale. One of the reasons why this is such a hard problem from a law enforcement perspective is that the operators, the final stage, the boss stage, are located in jurisdictions where you can't really motivate law enforcement to actually go catch the guys, if you even are able to identify them, which is extraordinarily difficult on the internet. This is why the only way to win is to create a fiscal disincentive. We're not going to be able to catch all these bad guys. Even if we could catch all these bad guys, if the crime was still profitable, new people would just come in and fill the space. So what we need to do is actually direct the money elsewhere. It's the only solution that is sustainable. And that's it for my time. Thank you so much, everyone.